The Ethiopian Bible is the oldest Bible. The oldest copy of the Ethiopian Bible, which is full in terms of a Genesis to Revelation copy, is 14th century.
A Bible hidden for over 1,500 years, locked in a distant Ethiopian monastery. Inside lies a post-resurrection story missing from every other gospel. Generations ignored it, scholars overlooked it, and history nearly erased it. What secret did it guard? What truth did we lose? Today, we open the Garima Gospels and step into a chapter of Christianity we almost forgot. The secret passage, hidden in plain sight. For years, most of us grew up thinking the Bible we read today is the same all over the world. The same 4 Gospels, the same chapters, and the same endings are repeated in churches everywhere. And of course, we hardly questioned it because it felt settled. But when researchers started digging into early Christian history, they discovered something shocking. The Bible is far more complicated than it seems. Some parts of the story survived only because they were tucked away far from Europe, while others were lost, rewritten, or simply forgotten. Now, somewhere in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, there's a monastery called Abba Garima. It's remote, almost impossible to reach, and it has kept something extraordinary hidden for centuries. Inside this monastery exists a book many believe was never meant to be read. Its pages were kept from the public eye.
Christianity is huge. This isn't very surprising given that it is the largest religion in the world.
Written in languages only a handful of scholars could understand. The book is called the Garima Gospels, and it is very different from the Bibles most of us know today. This book has existed for more than 1,600 years, and somehow we didn't know about it until recently. The Garima Gospel is one of the oldest known Christian books ever discovered. It was kept for hundreds of years by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, dating back to between 330 and 650 AD. This means the Garima Gospels were created while the Roman Empire still dominated the ancient world, when gladiators fought in the Colosseum, and long before the English language even emerged. And while Europe would later fall into centuries of turmoil, often described as the Dark Ages, Ethiopia had already built a thriving and sophisticated Christian tradition of its own. These books contain the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are written in Ge'ez, the old church language of Ethiopia.
Ethiopia is home to one of the oldest Christian churches in the world, dating back to the early 4th century.
For thousands of years, Ethiopian monks have carefully protected them. While most of the world didn't even know about them, these Gospels show how important the Christian faith has been in Ethiopia for a very long time. The monks didn't just guard the books from theft or invasion, they protected them from time itself. Wars, fires, harsh weather, and even insect damage could have destroyed them, yet they remain intact. To the monks, these are not just books. They are living links to the earliest days of their faith, connections to teachings and stories that the rest of the world tried to forget. The Garima Gospels include books that most of us have never seen, like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. These passages tell stories about angels, giants, and spiritual battles. Events the Western Church later decided were too dangerous or too strange. In Ethiopia, they were kept safe, untouched, and preserved as part of sacred tradition. Even the artistry of the manuscripts is intriguing. The illustrations show intricate patterns, birds, animals, and detailed designs that remain vivid even after centuries. Scholars long assumed that a manuscript this sophisticated could only have come from Europe.
Only the Ethiopian church survived the burning. Its spiritual leader was an Egyptian.
But the Garima Gospels prove Ethiopia had its own master artists and a rich history of illustration. Legend has it, Saint Garima, the monk who created the manuscript, wrote the entire book in a single day. The story claims God stopped the sun so he could finish it in one day. Historians dismissed this as impossible, but carbon dating confirms the manuscript really was created in that era. Here, science and legend meet in a way that feels almost magical, right in the highlands of Ethiopia. What makes the Garima Gospels so fascinating is not just their age, but what they contain. They contain all four of the familiar Gospels, written in Ge'ez, the ancient church language of Ethiopia. This means we are looking at one of the earliest complete versions of the New Testament ever discovered. When you open the pages, it is not just the words that stand out. The illustrations are bright and full of detail, showing how early Ethiopian Christians understood the life of Jesus and the resurrection.
And start asking what's historically accurate. Jesus, whether you say Jesus.
They do not add new books beyond Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the fact that these texts survived gives us a rare glimpse of Christianity before the changes and edits that later shaped the Western Bible. The careful artwork and rich detail reveal a world where faith was not only about teachings, but also about a larger struggle between good and evil, something that early believers felt and imagined in their daily lives. For centuries, Western scholars doubted the existence of the Garima Gospels. Many assumed Africa could not produce a manuscript of such sophistication while Europe struggled through the Dark Ages. They dismissed the monks and the monastery as well-meaning but untrained. Because these texts weren't in Rome or Constantinople, they assumed they didn't matter. But before we get into the passage itself, let's talk about what makes the Ethiopian Bible different from the one most of us know. Why did it survive when so many others didn't? And what might it be holding that the rest of the world has never seen? What makes the Garima Gospel different? The Ethiopian Bible is very different from the Bible most of us know. The first major difference is the number of books. The popular Western Bible has 66 books. Catholics added a few more to make 73, but the Ethiopian Bible has 81. That's right, 81 books, including some you've probably never even heard of. And these aren't just any stories, they include the Book of Enoch, which tells of angels interacting with humans and mysterious giants walking the earth. The Book of Jubilees retells early Genesis with extra details, almost like a hidden diary of the world's first days. It didn't stop there. There are also the books of Maccabees, and even early letters attributed to Clement, a church leader from the 1st century.
The religion exists in many different forms, different churches and denominations around the world.
Many of these writings were considered too strange or too complex by the authorities in Rome and Constantinople. The councils in the 4th century, which decided what counted as official scripture, left these books out. Some were seen as mystical, others as a challenge to the growing power of the Roman Church. Across Europe, these texts disappeared. They were rewritten, ignored, or simply forgotten. But in Ethiopia, they survived, tucked away in monasteries where the outside world couldn't reach them. The way Ethiopia preserved these texts is remarkable. The monks didn't just store the books. They cared for them, copied them by hand, and kept them alive through generations. They lived in remote, rugged places, often on mountainsides, in harsh weather, with almost no contact with the outside world. These weren't your regular caretakers. They were guardians of knowledge and tradition.
The beat of the prayer stick and the liturgical dances are rather reminiscent of ancient Judaism.
Every night, their prayers and their work were intertwined with the manuscripts. They weren't trying to prove a point to Rome or make history. They simply believed these texts were sacred, and they protected them like priceless treasures. The language also matters. The Garima Gospels and other Ethiopian manuscripts are written in Ge'ez, a language still alive in church rituals today. It's not just a translation, it's a living record of how early Christians thought and wrote. Reading these texts feels very different from reading a modern Bible. They preserve ideas and stories that later councils and Western traditions cut away. You can almost feel a world where angels walked among humans, where spiritual battles were real, and where early followers of Jesus understood the universe in ways we rarely see today. And then there's the artistry. The illustrations are vivid. Birds, animals, intricate patterns. Hundreds of years later, the colors are still strong. Scholars long assumed a manuscript this detailed could only have come from Europe, but Ethiopia proves it had its own masters.
But it has to be thin, because thin parchment is better for writing.
Its own history, and its own eye for beauty. But despite all these details, most of the world had no idea these texts existed. But here's the thing. The Ethiopian Bible does matter. It shows that the early Christian story was not as simple as we learned in Sunday school. It was bigger, stranger, and more mysterious. And while we may never know every reason why certain texts were left out of the Western canon, Ethiopia's preservation proves there was more to the story than we were told. So what else is hidden in these 81 books? What secret did the post-resurrection passage hold while the rest of the Christian world moved on? And could it change everything we think we know about the earliest days of Christianity? The lost post-resurrection message. Now, for years, the Gospel of Mark that tells the story of resurrection ended in a way that left people unsettled. The earliest manuscripts stop at chapter 16, verse 8, where the women visit Jesus' tomb, find it empty, and then they run, scared out of their minds. That's it. No appearances, no instructions, no final closure. But later manuscripts, centuries after, added verses 9 through 20, showing Jesus appearing to his disciples and giving them instructions. Scholars have debated for ages which version comes closest to what the early Christians actually read. Now, here's where Ethiopia changes everything. The Garima Gospels, written in Ge'ez between the 4th and 7th centuries, preserve the Gospel of Mark in its earliest form. And here's the twist. Unlike later European Bibles, they don't include the extra verses that were added centuries later. It simply ended where the women ran away terrified after visiting the tomb. This gives us a rare glimpse into how early Christians in Ethiopia experienced the resurrection story, untouched by the later edits and political decisions that shaped the Western Church. But here's the question that still unsettles many historians. How did these passages survive only in Ethiopia and nowhere else? It wasn't simply because the country was far from Europe on the map. It's because Christianity in Ethiopia developed independently, away from the councils, controversies, and power struggles that dominated and shaped the rest of the Christian world. You might not immediately think of Ethiopia when you think of early Christianity. But here's the truth. Ethiopia is one of the oldest Christian nations in the world. By the 4th century, King Ezana had officially adopted the faith, long before most European kingdoms existed. Its churches and monasteries were built in remote valleys, on high mountains, and even inside cliffs. These places were not only beautiful, they acted like safes, protecting texts and teachings from outsiders. Meanwhile, in Europe, things were very different. Church leaders and councils decided which books were considered official. Texts that were seen as too strange, symbolic, or challenging to their authority were often left out. Some books gradually disappeared because they were no longer copied or preserved. This is why stories about angels, giants, or unseen spiritual battles rarely appear in the Western Bible today. Also, the Ethiopian Christian community doesn't answer to Rome or Constantinople. They kept not just the canonical Gospels, but a whole range of older traditions. What they preserved is amazing. In the early 2000s, researchers from Oxford and the Ethiopian Manuscript Microfilm Library found thousands of Ge'ez manuscripts. Ge'ez is Ethiopia's ancient church language. Some of these manuscripts are so old that they come before famous European biblical books. Take the Garima Gospels, for example. Radiocarbon dating shows they were made in the 5th or 6th century. This makes them older than most illustrated Christian books in Europe. And here is the surprising part. They are still in great shape. The colors are bright, the illustrations untouched. Scholars could hardly believe it. A complete gospel book, older than the Codex Sinaiticus, sits silently in an Ethiopian monastery. It didn't stop there. These manuscripts don't just repeat the stories you've heard in church. They include changes, additions, and passages not in the Bible most people know. For centuries, People thought the Bible was the same everywhere, but Ethiopia's books tell a different story. Imagine opening one of these manuscripts and finding Jesus speaking after the resurrection, words that don't appear in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Imagine discovering instructions or messages that expand the story beyond what we thought we knew. These are not made-up stories. They were copied carefully by monks who believed every word mattered. And the reason they survived is simple. Ethiopia stood apart. While Europe was busy arguing, editing, and cutting books, Ethiopia kept everything. The mountains protected them. The monasteries kept them safe. And the monks made sure these voices would never be lost. Now, the Garima Gospels reveal the resurrection wasn't just about hope and salvation. It was about awareness that evil is real, that spiritual battles were happening all around. Now we can understand why the early church might have been uneasy about this book. Unlike the familiar resurrection stories in the Bible, this gospel also shows events and teachings that are deeper, more complex, and sometimes unsettling. There are even reports that the book describes encounters with unseen forces, spiritual battles, and lessons that go beyond simple faith. Early church leaders may have felt these details were too controversial, too challenging, or too difficult for ordinary believers to fully grasp. This also tells us something important about early Christian history. Stories weren't fixed. They were edited, reshaped, and sometimes suppressed, depending on who was in power. The Garima Gospels survived, offering a version of the resurrection that stayed closer to the earliest traditions, one where Jesus' return signals not just victory over death, but the beginning of a battle against unseen spiritual dangers. If this Ethiopian Bible preserved a story the rest of the world lost, what does it reveal about the decisions that shaped the Bible? And what might it still be quietly trying to show us? What this Ethiopian Bible wants us to see? Some books survive because they were protected, and others survive because someone refused to let their pages disappear. This Ethiopian manuscript is one of those books. For centuries, it stayed untouched in a world that kept rewriting and reshaping the Bible into the version most people know today. It was not praised, debated, or placed in the spotlight. It simply sat where it had always been, holding pieces of early Christian history that later traditions chose to leave behind. When we look at this book closely, it becomes clear that it is more than an old manuscript. It is a reminder that the story of Christianity did not grow from one voice or one path. Different communities kept different memories. Some kept stories that were simple, safe, and easy to explain. Others kept stories that were bold, emotional, or uncomfortable. The Ethiopian Church chose to preserve texts that other regions set aside, and this choice gives us a rare doorway into how early believers understood their faith. But to understand why a post-resurrection passage survived in Ethiopia and vanished everywhere else, we have to look at the early European Church. In the first centuries after Jesus, Christianity was growing fast, and leadership was scattered. Different areas had their own writings, their own teachings, and their own traditions. The moment leaders in Europe began shaping a single unified Bible, they faced a serious problem. Too many books, too many stories, too many voices. And some of those voices did not agree with one another. The resurrection was the heart of the faith. It was the moment everything changed. So church leaders wanted a clean, simple version of those events. Anything that added questions, new moments, or extra scenes felt risky. A longer resurrection story could create arguments or encourage groups to form their own ideas about Jesus' final message. A passage that survived only in the Ethiopian tradition might have raised doubts about which community had the true account. There were also political reasons. A united empire wanted a united belief system. Leaders feared that extra passages, especially ones found outside Europe, could weaken their control over doctrine. Including a story they did not fully understand, or one they could not shape, felt dangerous. Removing it was easier than explaining it. So some texts were copied less often. Others were quietly set aside. and a few were erased completely. Meanwhile, Ethiopia did the opposite. Instead of narrowing its canon, it protected more books, more stories, and more early Christian voices. It preserved writings that vanished everywhere else, not because they were strange or harmful, but because Ethiopia believed no part of the story should be lost. This is why a passage missing in Europe continued to survive in Africa, not by accident, but by choice. As scholars study these forgotten pages today, one thing becomes obvious. The Bible as we know it is the result of decisions. Human decisions shaped by culture, leadership, fear, and hope. This Ethiopian book shows that the past was never as clean or controlled as later history made it seem. There were many versions, many voices, and many ways early believers tried to hold on to what they felt was true. Finding a passage that does not appear in other Bibles is not meant to shake faith. It shows that there is more to learn, more to understand, and more to explore. These old texts remind us that history does not stand still. It changes. It reveals new layers when we are willing to look beyond the familiar pages. Maybe the lesson this book offers is simple. The stories we think we fully understand may still hold hidden corners. And sometimes, the oldest books are the ones that quietly protect pieces of history we were never taught to see. After 2,000 years, this Ethiopian Bible still holds secrets the world forgot. It reminds us that history is shaped by choices and that some stories were lost along the way. But if one book could survive against the odds, what other truths might still be waiting to be discovered? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.